Section 7.3 of the course, increasing the money supply, or more correctly, what we're looking at here is how the money supply can actually be increased. Now, before we do that, we need to remind ourselves why economists are so interested in the process through which the money supply can be increased. And increases in the money supply in an economy are important because they're directly linked to the inflation rate. And to understand that, let's just revisit the equation of exchange. What we said in the last video was that any increase in the money supply will generally move through and increase the price level by increases in the money supply will flow through and increase the price level roughly by a similar amount. Now, when I say that sort of thing, I am talking about reasonably large increases in the price level. So if you get an increase in the money supply of 2% or 4%, it may be possible that the additional spending generated by that increase in the money supply can be satisfied by increasing Q if there's excess capacity in the economy. But when you get to the point where you're increasing the money supply by 20, 30, 50, 100%, then there's no way that that sort of large increase in the money supply can be offset by increases in Q. It's just not possible. As I've indicated before, if you double the money supply, there isn't an economy in the world that could double its GDP. Its real GDP, that is its physical production. There just isn't that much excess capacity. And you might argue, well, couldn't output be doubled over 3, 4, 5, 10 years? Well, anything's possible, I guess. It's unlikely that you could grow that quickly, but anything's possible. The point is, if you double the money supply today, while you're waiting for Q to expand, to absorb all of this additional money, in a sense, you're going to get this very strong inflation. And so if you double the money supply, Q can't double. No economy can do that. If you double the money supply, history tells us that velocity will not halve to offset the doubling of the money supply. So when you double the money supply, very quickly it's going to move through to increases in the price level. That's the idea. That's why we're interested in the money supply and what can make it grow, and also ensuring that it doesn't grow too quickly. Because if it does, it's just going to move through this equation and send prices spiraling upwards. Just ask people in Zimbabwe, ask people in Venezuela, what happens when the government, the central bank, increases the money supply very, very rapidly. You end up with massive inflation, and you end up having to print banknotes with a lot of zeros on the end, because the price level's increasing so rapidly. The price of bread, milk, all of those things that you buy, the price is increasing so rapidly that your old $5 note just won't buy you a thing anymore. So the banknotes have to become, the banknotes have to kind of match the price level, and you just keep adding zeros to the end of the banknotes. I've actually got one of these notes, the $100 trillion note myself. There's a lot of them around, you can imagine. You can pick them up in sort of stamp and currency shops in the city, and then they're quite cheap to buy. So that's why we need an understanding of increases in the money supply, because if the money supply grows too quickly, it will fuel inflation. Okay, so there are three ways of increasing the money supply. The first one is printing notes and coins. So let's have a look at that. Really, I shouldn't have added coins here because I'm not aware of any central bank that has massively increased the money supply through the printing of coins. It's just notes for obvious reasons. So what I've got here is an example of a very strong inflation that resulted from very strong growth in the money supply in Germany just after the end of the First World War. So just after the end of the First World War in Germany, the First World War ended in 1918, started in 1914, but ended in 1918. You can just imagine what the German economy was like at the time. The country had lost the First World War. It was devastated, and the German government and German people were trying to rebuild the country. So you can just imagine the work the German government at the time had in front of it. The German government would have needed to rebuild so many different things, from buildings to roads to bridges to port facilities. So many things were needed to be rebuilt and redeveloped. And so think about the government then. So you've just lost the First World War. You know that you need to rebuild the country after losing the First World War. Where do you get the money from as a government? Well, you could borrow it. That's one option. But you've just lost the First World War. The question would then be, who is going to lend you that money? Would there have been countries out there, you'd have to check the history books, would there have been countries out there willing to lend Germany the volumes of money it needed at that time to rebuild the country? Interesting question. The information may actually not be in any of the history books, but that would be one, borrow the money. The second would be through taxing your citizens and taxing businesses. As the government increase taxes, collect that revenue, and use that to rebuild the country, rebuild the infrastructure of the country that had been destroyed. That's one possibility. But it's just after the Second World War, the country is in ruins, everyone's struggling to rebuild the country, and you come along as a government and start taxing people at extraordinarily high rates to rebuild the infrastructure of the country. Is that going to work? The third option is simply to get your central bank to print more money. Finance the expenditure by printing more money. Now, governments around the world have done this over the last couple of 100 years. It's not an uncommon event where governments have few other options other than to print money and spend the money. Now, this may sound a little bit like quantitative easing. Okay, but it's not. It's very different to quantitative easing. And I'll explain why a little bit later. So Germany, after the Second World War, the government was just increasing, printing more money and increasing the money supply to then fund the rebuilding of the country. From the equation of exchange, this one, we know that if the money supply increases rapidly, it should increase the price level. And so in this table, rather than looking at, say, the price of bread or wheat or some other commodity, the author has used the price of gold. Now, the price of gold is probably, over this period, would have probably been broadly correlated with the price of bread, milk, and other staples that people used to consume at the time, coffee, whatever. Broadly correlated. Now, you might argue that for some reason that the price of gold is not an accurate or wouldn't be highly correlated with the prices of other goods and services. I can think of a couple of arguments for that, but this is good enough for our purpose. So what we're saying is the price of gold would have been roughly correlated with the prices of goods and services that consumers purchased in Germany over the same period of time. I'm just saying roughly correlated. That's all we need. But have a look at what happened. The price of gold in January 1919 started off at 170 German marks per ounce. 2 years later, that price had gone from 170 German marks, 2 years later down here, to 1,350. Okay, that's an increase of what? About 8 times. So the price level of gold had increased by a factor of 8. Now, maybe the price of bread had not increased by quite 8 times. It might have increased by a little bit more, a little bit less, but roughly speaking, let's say it increased by 8 times as well. But then things really started to get interesting in 1922, 1923. Look at the rate of increase in the price of gold and therefore the price of other consumables in the country, or price of consumables. Look what happened. The most interesting period to me is this period between November 5 and November 30. That is a 25-day period. 25 days, 3.5 weeks. Look what the price of gold and therefore the price of, say, bread did. It increased by a factor of 10 times in 25 days. Ten times. That's 900% inflation in 25 days. 2022 in Australia, inflation was around 6-7%. For the year, Germany had 900% inflation for 25 days. It's crazy. There are a lot of books written, and you certainly don't need to read any of this for this course. What you need to understand is more the relationship between the money supply and the price level, and how severe things can get, how bad things can get. But there are a lot of books that tell some very interesting stories over this period, and I've read a few of them. And one story that really sticks in my mind is over this period towards the end of 1923, what you would do in Germany is you'd go into a restaurant, and the prices of what was available for you to buy in the restaurant were listed on a blackboard. And so you would select what you wanted, pay for it, and then food would be delivered. You'd have your lunch and you'd wander off. But what would happen is, by the time you had actually finished your lunch, maybe an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours later, the prices would have changed. Now, you weren't subject to those higher prices. Apparently, you paid the price that was on the whiteboard when you went into the restaurant. But when you have 900% inflation over a 25-day period, prices don't change daily. They were changing hourly. And you can imagine how it would have to have happened that way. Prices were changing every hour. And this picture here is a picture of a German woman using the currency to actually light her stove. Or it might have been a heater, I'm not quite sure. But she was burning the currency, because quickly prices become so high and they get so out of control that the money itself becomes worthless. So you might be holding a $1 million or 1 million mark note. If you hold on to that note for too long, then 2 weeks later, it's going to buy you nothing. So quickly you can see that the old money, with the money that didn't have enough zeros in it, the small denomination notes, will quickly become worthless. And so what happens in this hyperinflation type period is, if we go back to the equation of exchange, the government increases the money supply. So maybe they print an additional 50 million marks over this period. That is going to flow through and increase the price level. Now, the problem is, for the government, next time they come and print another lot of new money, they can't print the same 50 million marks, because it won't have the same purchasing power as the original 50 million marks, because the original 50 million marks has pushed the price level up. So if you print another 50 million, it's going to buy you maybe a half, 3/4 of what the original 50 million marks purchased, because of the resulting inflation. So you might print 50 million marks and spend that money and have that money circulating in the economy the first time around, but then to stay ahead of the inflation next time, you're probably going to have to print and spend 100 billion marks. Then that'll push the price level up further. Next time, you'll have to stay ahead of the inflation. No point in printing 100 billion marks again. You've got to print 200 billion marks, and then 500 billion marks. So each round of money printing is generally involves a larger amount of new money than the previous round. Hopefully you get the idea. And so just imagine if you plotted the money supply in Germany over time, you're going to get this exponential growth in the money supply through this effect. And so you can see if the government is then doing that, so they're printing more new money each time than the previous round to stay ahead of the inflation, the money supply grows exponentially. And of course, you get the price level growing exponentially. That's the way it works. But it actually gets worse than that and more interesting. What happens is as the money supply grows over time in these sorts of economies that do this, and it's not just Germany that's been through this, Yugoslavia's been through this, Italy's been through this, Hungary, Israel, more recently Zimbabwe, and talk to anyone who's gone to Venezuela recently. It happens every time, and governments just don't seem to learn, because every decade we seem to find another government somewhere in the world doing this. It creates massive inflation and it just ends up destroying the economy. The value of a country's currency is so important. It's so important to protect the value of a country's currency. And you create value for a $100 note, for example, by not printing too many of them. In a sense, they're scarce. And that's why they retain their value. If you just keep printing more of something, it's going to lose its value. And a banknote will lose its value when you have too much money creating inflation. So any one banknote in the presence of inflation will become just worth less and less and less over time. So coming back to this equation of exchange, not only do you have the money supply growing exponentially, which then kicks off exponential inflation and gives you these ridiculous inflation rates that countries experience, but at the same time, the velocity of money starts ticking up as well. It starts increasing. Think about it. The velocity of money is effectively the number of times the money supply is spent in, say, a year. It's the speed at which you spend money. So what's happening? The money supply is increasing in Germany. You're living, let's say, 102, 103 years ago in 1920, and the government's increasing the money supply. That is then increasing the price level. And it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And you hit January 1923, and now the inflation rate, or the price level, is increasing by a factor of 1,000 times per year. The inflation rate's kind of just totally out of control. And you get paid. You get paid on, say, a Thursday. What do you do with your pay? You go out and spend it as quickly as you can. Because if you hold on to your pay, and you would have been paid back then 100 years ago, excuse me, in excuse me, in notes. It wouldn't have been a bank account. Excuse me, sorry. It wouldn't have been a bank account deposit. You would have been paid in notes. So what are you going to do? You get paid on a Thursday. You're going to spend that money as quickly as you possibly can. And another story that I read about this period was a couple. They were married, and the husband was working, the wife was looking after the kids at home, you know, very sort of traditional setup 100 years ago. And so he would get paid, I think, once a week. And what he would then do would be race home with his pay. He would give half of his money to his wife. His wife would then rush off and purchase the food they needed for that week. He would take his money, go into the black market and swap his currency for, I can't remember the currency that he swapped it for. I can't recall if it was sort of British pounds or US dollars or something else, but he would actually get rid of his currency. He might have actually switched it into gold. Anyway, the point is he was switching it for some other asset. And the urgency that was conveyed in that text was pretty incredible. They would literally, he would run home and then his wife would be running off and purchasing groceries, and he'd be running to wherever he ran to switch his currency into another currency, or perhaps gold or something else of value. So the point I'm making is that when you behave that way and you get your pay and you spend it as quickly as possible, that's the velocity of money increasing. So over this period that Germany experienced this extraordinary inflation, not only did M increase exponentially, but V was going through the roof as well. The velocity of money. People were getting rid of any new money that they received as quickly as possible. And so if M is going through the roof and V is going through the roof, that is a massive rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. There's massive increases in overall spending. Now, Q can't match that. So of course, you just get massive inflation as a result of this. So the inflation that Germany experienced and a lot of these other countries experienced is not just a result of increases in the money supply, it's also increases in the velocity of money, the speed at which this given money supply is spent, that produces the ridiculously high levels of inflation. So looking back to these numbers, what would have been happening over this time is the money supply wouldn't have quite have been increasing at the rate of the price of gold. So what I'm saying is the price of gold here was being driven higher by both increases in M and increases in V. So if you had data on the growth in the or changes in the money supply over the same period, the money supply wouldn't have been growing at the same rate as the price increases in the price of gold. Because what was, as I said, what was driving this increase in the price of gold was big increases in M as well as increases in the velocity of money. And that's kind of what I've got down here. In a sense, this is a period of hyperinflation. That's the name for this massive inflation. So generally what happened is the money supply would increase. That would increase the price level. People will then rush off and hoard commodities such as food, which then led to further increases in the price of those commodities because of shortages. But then the government, to beat the inflation, would do this all over again and increase the money supply. That led to further increases in the price of these commodities and the price level more generally. And on top of that, in addition to all of this process that I've just described, you'd have the velocity of money going through the roof as well. So if you're interested in this sort of process, have a look at what happened in Zimbabwe in recent years and what's happened in Venezuela as well. The only way you can get this sort of inflation is through massive increases in the money supply. The second way the money supply can increase is through quantitative easing. Now, you're full bottles on that, so I really don't want to describe to you what QE is, because you'll be, as I said, we've sort of, we'll go through that separately. But just one thing I wanted to point out is that both printing of notes and the QE involves an increase in the amount of base money, increase in base money. So base money, if we go back, is here, money base. It's this very narrow definition of money. Okay, so in the first case where the government prints currency, that's just an increase in that component of base money there, the currency. And QE, for now, I want you to just think of QE as involving an increase in the amount of currency as well. The currency is notes and coins, okay? But just for now, I just want you to imagine QE involving the printing of money. Even though it doesn't, it kind of has a similar effect. So yeah, so QE is both printing of notes and coins, and QE involves an increase in base money. Now, what that actually, yeah, I'm sort of processing this as I'm thinking about it, but what this increase in base money means will become very clear when we move on to this slide here. There is a difference between base money and broad money, and these two slides I'm actually going to explain how base money and broad money, so how base money here and broad money are related. So what I'm suggesting here is that printing of notes and coins and currency, sorry, printing of notes and coins as well as QE increase base money. So actually the easiest way to think about this is, I was suggesting previously, imagine QE is currency. That's just going to be too confusing. So just imagine now that both the printing of notes and coins and QE, just accept that they both involve increases in this narrow measure of money called base money. And it's a narrow measure of money because the volume of base money is only about 6% of nominal GDP in Australia. This is a broader measure of money because the total amount of broad money equals 112% of nominal GDP. So if nominal GDP in Australia is 2 trillion, then the money base in Australia is 6% of 2 trillion. So that, in that sense, the money base is a smaller value. It's a smaller amount of money than broad money. But as I said, just for now, consider both the printing of notes and coins and QE as both increasing the money supply. And both of them are a type of base money. Okay? And what I mean by that will become much clearer when I tackle the third way of increasing the money supply. Okay, but what I'll do, the way I'll do that, well, no, actually what I'll do is create a separate video to finish off section 7.3, where I go through the final way of increasing the money supply, which is the credit creation process through the banks. Okay, so there's 2 slides there. So we'll come back to this idea. So what have we covered? Basically, there are 3 ways in which the money supply can be increased. The first, printing of notes and coins, or printing of currency. The second, QE, and you know how that works. And what I'm asking you to do is the first 2, 1 and 2, just in your mind for now, accept that both of those are a form of base money. Okay, so we'll leave it there, and I'll produce another video which finishes off section 7.3.